Welcome back to the channel. Today we have quite the project to tackle. We are going to be pulling out the transmission from the Miata to install this new ACT clutch. In the previous video, I talked about how to pick your clutch, how to determine if it is bad, and the different types of clutch discs available on the market. I unboxed my clutch. This is a 6-puck sprung clutch. I am super excited to get this into the car and see what kind of power I can throw at it. Before we can get to taking the transmission out of the vehicle, we need to tackle a couple of things to prep for it. We need to pull the downpipe out, the full mid-pipe exhaust, and the back end. We need to remove the drive shaft, the PPF or the power plant frame, and we need to drain the transmission fluid to help make it just a little bit lighter when we're dropping it out. We will be pulling the transmission and swapping the clutch on jack stands. I also have tires underneath the rear tires of the vehicle to help brace it a little bit just in case something were to happen. We do need to kind of shimmy shake the transmission out of the flywheel to get it down and out. That does require some shaking of the car. We do not want this to drop on us. I also bolted the front tires back onto the vehicle just for an extra precaution, just in case it would happen to slip off the jack stands in the front. There's something there so it won't go all the way crashing down to the ground and squish me or severely hurt me. I also have the jack left up on the subframe up in the front. So what we're gonna start with first is actually up on top of the car. I need to pull out the 4 10mm bolts that hold the shifter in place in the boot and get that pulled out of the way so the transmission can be dropped out. Then continuing on the top side of the vehicle, we're gonna be pulling off the V-band that holds the 2-piece downpipe together. We're going to take that off so the lower portion can drop out with the mid-pipe. Then we will drop down to the underside of the car where we will pull out the front section of the mid-pipe and then the rear portion as well, so it's completely out of the way and we don't have anything hanging and dangling in our way to pull the transmission out. Now after we pull the exhaust out, we will be taking out this big channel with the 2 bolts right up front, this third one just a little bit back, and then there's 2 bolts in the back where the diff is, and we're going to completely drop that power plant frame out of the way. So we're going to get right into the work, start pulling some of this stuff off, and hopefully have this transmission out in no time. So this is a little unfortunate. I bought this about 1.5 years ago. The shifter boot is ripped in multiple places, which is unfortunate, but I think it's only like 30 bucks on Amazon for a new one of these, so maybe I'll have to look into getting a new one. All right, it's been maybe an hour. I've got the PPF out, drive shaft out, front trans brace out. Then if we hop over to the other side real quick, we got the whole exhaust out of the vehicle, including the downpipe up there. We got the transmission drained, so there's no fluid in it. Got a nice open trans tunnel for lots of room for activities down here. So this next step is going to be a little bit hard to show you guys. So I got to point it out, and then I'm going to have to set the camera down. We got to take out the slave cylinder right here. I think there's 2 12mm bolts, and then there's a bolt up there that holds the wire harness. I'm pointing at it right there, a 12mm, and then a couple more things where the brake line connects, or not brake line, but the clutch line connects up in here. It's really hard to see, way up in the top. There's another one that I have to disconnect so that the clutch master can kind of be set off to the side. And then I need to take the starter bolts out. They're 12mm bolts. I need to remove those 2 bolts off the starter up there. Otherwise I cannot get the bell housing fully removed off of the backside of the engine. Then we're going to move to all of the bolts around the bell housing, holding it to the engine. Before we take all the bolts all the way out, we will have to move the jack from the subframe up there as a brace, move it to the back so it doesn't just drop on my face. All right, well, I am just about at the point where I can pull the transmission out. I got all the bolts out of the way. Slave cylinder is off. Wire harness is unbolted from the top. As you can kind of tell, all of the bolts are out of the transmission. All that is holding it in is basically just the input shaft on the transmission in the flywheel and the pressure plate. So just a little bit of shimmy shake and this thing should come off. but I do need to clean off all this oil. I don't want that going all over me. And I believe the rear main seal that is back in there is probably leaking again, because this is all oil coming out of the bolt holes on the bottom of the transmission. So that is not super great, but that rear main seal is not very expensive. It's like 12 or 14 bucks. So I will replace that when we have this all apart. All right, let's get under here and pull this transmission out. Now this is kind of the interesting part, because I'm going to pull this out and set it down on my chest and kind of roll it off of me. It's not a very big transmission, but it's still kind of awkward because I'm laying on the ground and there's not a ton of clearance under here. So we're going to kind of shimmy it backwards a little bit towards the rear of the car and get the shifter to drop underneath the car. I believe I should have shifted it into like third or something. There we go, got it shifted into third, so then we kind of tip it and the shifter will pivot down through that hole. The slave cylinder should be pressed out of the way enough to where it's not going to catch. I think everything else should be good and loosened up. So let's get into position here between the stands. Try and get this thing shimmied out and protect the downstairs so I don't have this crush anything important. There we go. There we go. I'll just push this all the way down out the back. Okay, transmission out of the vehicle. That is not the issue here. The issue we are trying to solve is the clutch disc is slipping on the flywheel and the pressure plate. It's not able to hold the power that I'm putting down currently. I'm not putting down a ton of power. I'm only running 8 pounds, but that 8 pounds, when you get into higher gears, is a lot of load to put on a stock clutch. So we have to take this pressure plate off, then we're gonna pull the clutch disc out. We're gonna take a quick inspection, and then we're gonna get it all cleaned up. Hopefully the main seal is not bad, because it doesn't actually look too bad. Just from sitting here, there's not oil inside of where the bow housing was. So I'm not entirely sure what's leaking there, but we're gonna look. So we're gonna pull that out, take an inspection, then hopefully we can start getting the new clutch put on and prep to put the transmission back in the car already. It's only been about an hour and a half of work, and we got the transmission out of the car. We got the clutch pressure plate and the clutch disc out of the vehicle. We're gonna show you that real quick. This is the flywheel side. You flip it over, that is the pressure plate side. So, doesn't look real bad at all. I mean, this side anyways. But if you look at it from here, it's probably hard for you guys to see. The flywheel side, not super deep of grooves in that anymore. I mean, I sharpened this with like a little hacksaw blade to like give it more of an edge when I put this in. Not recommended. Probably shouldn't have done that, but it lasted an entire season. It still has quite a bit of like bite on the edges of these. But I mean, there's a lot of clutch material that's coming off, like a lot of powder on that. This is a solid sprung disc compared to the 6-puck. The material here is more of like a fibrous that's packed, and then this is like a completely different like stone material you'd see on like a brake pad or something. This is going to be way more aggressive than this on that flywheel and in the transmission. When we look at the pressure plate, there is a little bit of like some heat marks. Not super bad. I've seen a lot worse in the past. This one is actually pretty decent. So you can see how much like slip there was based on how much heat there is in this disc. The flywheel has a little bit of spotting, not very much. But it looks like the cross hatching is still on the flywheel, like it's brand new. So that is another plus. We will still use that flywheel. This pressure plate obviously is not for the ACT clutch. We have a pressure plate just for that. All right, so before we put a new throw bearing onto the input shaft of the transmission, we're gonna get this cleaned up a little bit. It seems as though maybe the leak is not from the rear main seal, but maybe the seal in the input shaft, or like the little gasket around this cap. I don't have one of those. I'd have to look into seeing like where I can get one. If I need to replace that or not, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's leaking a ton, but I don't want to cause any slipping issues if that is the reason it's leaking fluid or oil into the bell housing. That's not good. You don't want that stuff getting on your clutch. But I don't think it's getting on the clutch because it's coming from there and going down the bottom of the bell housing and kind of seeping out the bottom. If it was in the rear main seal, it would be seeping onto the back of the flywheel and throwing it all the way around inside the bell housing. That would create a bigger problem than what this probably is. So spray this down with some brake cleaner. And we'll get a rag and wipe some of this out. All right, so we're gonna get the new throwout bearing put onto the input shaft. The old one, if you listen close, doesn't sound super great. The new one is pretty snug. The bearing is nice and tight, and it does not spin loosely like that. It's not supposed to be just continuous spin like that. It's only supposed to spin when you put pressure on it. So that one's pretty wore out. Probably was causing some noise in there, because you could hear a little bit of noise coming from the transmission. I would assume it's that sitting there spinning on the pressure plate, especially when you're just sitting in there in neutral. It still has a little bit of pressure on the back of the pressure plate. It's a good thing we're replacing that. Anytime you pull out your transmission to do something with your clutch, swap in a new throwout bearing. They're pretty cheap and it's pretty easy to do. It just slides right onto the little fork and you're good to go. So we're gonna pop the foot back out so that we can put this on to the input shaft and then slide these two fork pieces on the back side of your throwout bearing. It goes up and down that way. We gotta slip that through enough so it'll pop back into the cup and on the throwout bearing. And there's the new throwout bearing that activates your pressure plate. Now we got the flywheel out. I just have a 25mm socket that's just about the perfect size. I could maybe go up just a little bit, but I don't know if I have a 26 to fit on there. There are other ways to get this pilot bearing out of the flywheel. I've seen a lot of people do like the bread trick where you pack bread behind it and then you take a little bit of like a pin or something and just keep packing it in and it pushes the bearing out. I don't need to do that. I wanted to take the flywheel off to be able to look at the seals behind it anyways. So this is just as easy for me. Most flywheel bolts are a torque to yield. What does that mean? You can only use it once, or you run the bolts in and it actually starts to spread the threads out. If you use them too many times, it can have the bolt fail and then you'll have bigger problems. Miata, however, does not have torque to yield bolts. You can use them over and over again. You just throw a little bit of Loctite on the threads to help hold them in case there's vibration so they don't back out on you. Now before we put the new pilot bearing back into the flywheel, I want to make sure this thing is spotless and clean. I don't want any oil residue left on the face of this where the clutch disc sits, nor do I want anything on the backside. There is a little bit of residue and stuff. We're just gonna give this a spray down and freshen this all up so we can put it back in the car with a fresh bearing and be ready for the clutch disc. Now that we got this all cleaned up, we are going to press in the new pilot bearing. And we want to try and get this to go in as evenly as possible, at least to level out or sit nice and flat to the clutch disc side. We're going to use a piece of flat, so where when we get all the way down to the plate, it basically stops nice and flush on this side of the flywheel. Nice and flush. So this little bit of bearing that sticks past goes inside of where the back of your crankshaft is, along with going inside of the flywheel right here. It helps cup that in to where you can get your bolts in. It helps center it all on your crankshaft. You want that all to be balanced so it spins nice and true and you don't have any internal engine issues. Now that we have the pilot bearing into the flywheel and we have the throwout bearing on the input shaft of the transmission, All we have to do before we put this stuff back into the car is get some of the residual oil that is sitting underneath by the rear main seal cleaned up and out of there. We don't want all that oil going back into the bell housing. We're gonna clean it up real nice. We're gonna take this piece of flat and kind of tap around on the rear main seal. It does look like it's not completely seated flush to the backside of the engine. So we're gonna make sure that's seated really nice, and that could be creating that little bit of oil that's at the bottom of the bell housing. Time to continue putting this back together. Ran into town, got some Loctite. So we should be able to get this flywheel bolted back in and we'll get it torqued down. Then we'll move on to putting the clutch disc and the pressure plate back in, Loctite the pressure plate bolts as well, and make sure this is all lined up with the clutch alignment tool, and hopefully get this transmission back in no time. We got the flywheel bolted back on, torqued to 75 foot-pounds. Now we got to move on to putting the disc on and the pressure plate and bolt it in and torque that to, I believe, like 19 foot-pounds or something. My torque wrench does not go that low. I'm going to be going based off of feel. My torque wrench only goes down to 25 foot-pounds, so we'll get that really close and just kind of make sure it's snugged up. Before we put the clutch disc and pressure plate up into the transmission area, we need to clean off the pressure plate. Your clutch disc comes in a sealed package with no lubricant or oil on it. Your clutch disc should never have any oil or lubrication on it whatsoever. That should stay clean and dry as best as you can keep it. The pressure plate, however, does come in a sealed plastic package with an oil coating on all of the metal pieces to keep that from rusting. You do not want any rust on that. So we have to clean off the plate and the spring portion of this pressure plate to make sure that there is no slip on the clutch disc whatsoever. So we'll just take some brake cleaner on that, basically spray the whole thing down, and then we'll wipe it down with a fresh rag to make sure it's all clean, and then let that kind of air out so that there's no residue left over or there's no wet brake cleaner. Now what we are going to do is take the clutch disc, stick that in the alignment tool, set that into the pilot bearing, just like that. Have it so the springs and the little marking that says transmission side is the correct direction. Now we'll take the pressure plate. I'm going to slap this in. This should go around those splines as well. I'm going to line up some of these bolt holes. And there's pegs that this should sit on. We got the bolts just finger tight in here. The alignment tool can move in here nice and easy. It looks like just eyeballing it straight and center in between all these teeth on the clutch pressure plate looks to be pretty good, and it's lined up real nice with the pilot bearing. Now we're going to go ahead and snug these bolts up. It doesn't take very much, so we'll get them snugged up, going like a star pattern. It should be good. Kind of go in stages too. You don't want this to push down in a weird way because it is spring loaded. So just kind of jump around a little bit. Go a little bit at a time until it starts getting snug. You should be all set. Next part is a little bit more difficult. We're going to slide the transmission back in there. I then have to roll the transmission back up onto my chest and then bench press it back up into position, slide the input shaft through the pressure plate, and get the splines to line up in the clutch disc, and then the end of the transmission shaft has to go into the pilot bearing inside. It is a little bit tricky. If it doesn't line up quite right on the first try, you do have to push the transmission down and slightly rotate the pressure plate and flywheel setup in the back to try and align the input shaft with the clutch disc. It is tricky, it is kind of hard. I'm doing it myself. This should be doable. I've done it in the past. Let's give it a shot. All right, just kind of like getting myself in position to bench press this thing up in there. It's not easy, it's really tight in here, especially with a transmission that you gotta set in your chest. So, let's get after this. the back end lifted up on your leg. Now I need to get the shifter through the hole up there first. Shift. Oh no, the shifter came back down through the hole. Come on, clutch. Don't want my brake line or clutch lines catching. I don't think my splines are lining up. I do. I brought my chisel down here. Rotate a little bit. Go. Yeah, there it is. Perfect, it slid right in there. Yeah, now I gotta reach the bolts. I think that's the right one. Once we got a couple bolts in here, we should be able to kind of lower this down and don't have to have my leg bracing it up. Ooh, my back is cramping underneath me. Kind of an awkward position. But we got it up in there. So we have the transmission bolted back in the car. The slave cylinder is in, the harness is bolted to the side of the transmission. That part is complete. The next step would be to put the drive shaft and the PPF back into the car. Before we do that though, I would like to sit in the car and test how the clutch feels before I get too far in putting stuff back together, just in case there is some sort of issue. So this won't be a true before and after test or like to show what the clutch feels like. The old clutch was like smooth as can be, light as a feather, super easy to push and release, really easy to drive. So we're gonna test it out with this one. I am under the assumption that it's going to be quite aggressive, a lot more firm of a pedal. Now we're gonna go give it a push. Oh yeah, that is way harder. And before, when I would press the clutch pedal would go completely all the way down to the ground. This now seems like it's not going fully to the ground, but it is fully engaging and disengaging. About like the top maybe inch or so is like really soft, like there's nothing there. So it's not like it's gonna be riding on the clutch there, so that's good. But then when you press in, it's not quite all the way to the floor, which I would assume that it's fully engaged. I can't imagine why it wouldn't be if you're all the way in and it gets hard. So we're gonna go with that. It should be fine. The only way to really know is once we have everything back in the car, turn it over and put it in first gear and see that it turns the rear wheels. So we'll keep on going with putting stuff back into the car and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Now we're just about ready to get this thing fired up and go for a test, but we do need to get the shifter all put back in place. I need the shifter boot back on there and the hydraulic handbrake bolted back into position. When I took the shifter boot out, the old one, it was torn. So that one is no good. Amazon has these OEM replacement ones for like 22 bucks and I got this next day shipped, which is awesome. So I haven't started it up in a little while, but it should be just fine. I'm gonna have it in neutral, clutch in, and the battery is low. I've had the battery charger hooked up for a couple of hours now, so it should be able to turn over and start. So it might have a little bit of tick. It needs to get some oil pressure built up and back up into the head. So we'll give it a shot. scratch that. It was not super rich. It was reading really lean because I forgot something. The O2 sensor is not back in the exhaust. So I have to go under there and put that back in. So now what I'm gonna do, put the clutch in, put it in first gear, let it out, and then just see the tires spin. As long as they spin, it should be all right. We'll kind of let the clutch settle into place a little bit. The clutch alignment tool only gets it so close to being centered all the way on the flywheel and the pressure plate. After you use it a little while, it'll center itself a little more. The alignment tool just gets it really close so you can get the transmission back together. Just kind of pumping the clutch a little bit. I bled it last night so it's nice and stiff. We got the clutch down. Shift it in gear. Take a look back there. Tires are not spinning with the clutch in, so that means it's fully engaged. Now we'll just lightly release it. It released real nice and easy and smooth. Just kind of let that run for a minute while we got kind of a high idle with it warming up. Then it gives it a chance to kind of just run the new transmission fluid through the transmission and also the new diff fluid in the back from a previous video. Alright, so just pulling it out of the garage, kind of backing it up, and then pulling back forwards, it does engage very aggressively. Without hardly even giving it any throttle, it was breaking the tires loose. So, that's going to be something to get used to. So we'll go out for a little cruise. We are not going to be ripping on it. We just need to get a couple of break-in miles before we try and have some fun. Alright, just accelerating out of the apartment. Very aggressive clutch. You got to be ready for it because it bites right away, which is super cool, but also very tricky to drive because it wants to basically spin the tires immediately. Great for drift, not so much for street. So keep that in mind when you're looking for a clutch. 6-puck is pretty aggressive. Tires aren't balanced either, so it kind of shakes. I do have to keep in mind as well, with the 205 50/16s, I'm going 5 miles an hour faster than my speedometer is actually telling me. So far, so good. Made it probably 5 miles. Feels really good. The unbalanced tires is what's getting me though. It shakes really bad at 55. That's my own fault though. Well, I didn't make it real far. Pretty sure that CV axle over there on the passenger side is broke. So I gotta limp it home. Hopefully I don't break something else. That's kind of a bummer, but they are the original CV axles to the car. So with adding stiffer poly bushings and aggressive clutch, and I got some pretty beefy tires on there right now, I guess it's better now than at the track. So yeah, we'll put it home. That's a bummer. I was just literally leaving the parking lot and it went clunk. Bummer. We are back at the garage. I got right into it and I tore the knuckle out so I can get the axle out of here. And that's what it looks like. I don't think it's actually broken. Nothing seems broken. There's a little snap ring that holds this in place inside where it swivels. That might be the only thing that kind of popped away, So that being said, I'm gonna see if I can take this boot off, see if I can get it back together and figure out why it popped apart. I don't think that there should be any reason it would have come out. It's kind of odd and strange that it did, but it's not that it like snapped or anything. I think it just pulled apart. So let's see if I can get this put back together and we can round out the video. Quick update. Axle, not repairable. I will show you. Well, I took my gloves off already. So there's about 1/4 of an inch at the very end of this axle shaft right here. This is the knuckle side. The inside, perfectly fine. That's the diff side, no big deal. The knuckle side, which is really strange, there's about 1/4 of an inch at the end, and this little snap ring holds it inside of the bearing that's inside of here. So the little 1/4 inch where that snap ring is decided to go clip, broke off. That's floating around inside behind the bearing. I'm pretty sure I can't repair that. I didn't think that the passenger side axle was going to be the problem. I thought the driver's side axle has been popping for a while. Maybe it's been the passenger side all along that's been making the popping sounds when you shift the weight back and forth, do a little shimmy shake in the burnout box, and it finally let loose. It was doing something really kind of dumb too. Like, I wasn't messing around on the street by any means. I was literally pulling out of my storage unit, typed in the number to get out, gate opened, started rolling back a little bit, let the clutch out, click, right there. I popped the end of the CV axle off. It's unfortunate, it was an accident. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit about Miata clutches anyways, pulling transmission out. If you like this video, smash that like button, drop a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe.